Hello, this is Jordan, and this is Quinn.
And we are really excited to get into this one with you.
Yeah, we are. So picture this. You are standing out in a sprawling field in North Dakota. It is a beautiful, bright morning.
Just a completely picture-perfect day.
Right. The sun is beating down on your shoulders. There is not a single cloud in the sky. To any human standing there, it feels like the absolute perfect day.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look around, you see rows upon rows of commercial beehives, thousands of those white wooden boxes stacked high.
A massive operation.
Exactly. But as you walk down those rows, you start to realize the ambient noise is, well, it's wrong. There is no low, steady hum of millions of wings. The bees aren't flying.
Which immediately tells you something is off.
Yeah, and instead, they are acting incredibly erratic. They're just crawling the front of the hive, pacing back and forth across the wooden landing boards in these tight, agitated circles.
They look like they want to launch, but they just won't.
Right. To an outsider, you might look up at that blue sky and wonder what on earth is wrong with your livestock. But then, you feel it against your face. The wind has suddenly picked up.
And that changes everything.
Completely. It is a powerful, humbling reminder that what we consider a nice day means absolutely nothing to a honeybee. Weather is more than just what we feel. It completely dictates every single aspect of bee behavior, survival, and productivity.
Which is such a fascinating disconnect between human perception and insect reality. I mean, when you look at a colony, you're not just looking at a box of bugs.
No, definitely not.
You are looking at a highly sensitive biological barometer. Those bees are constantly calculating these invisible environmental thresholds that we humans simply walk right through without a second
Right,
thought.
just put on a jacket or take off a sweater.
Exactly. So our mission for this discussion is to decode those exact hidden mathematical and biological thresholds of a honeybee's workday.
And it is a lot of math.
It really is. We are going to explore how real-time environmental data, and this is calibrated precisely against USDA ARS-B research laboratory standards, determines whether a hive thrives, starves, or produces, true clinical-grade honey.
And to track all of this invisible math, we rely on the live bee weather report.
Right.
For those of you managing your own apiaries or, if you were just curious about the invisible mechanics happening in your own backyard, this is a mobile-friendly dashboard that tracks these exact thresholds.
And it's incredibly accessible.
Yeah, you can pull it up right now on your phone by typing out Manuka woundscience.org. It translates all that complex environmental data into a clear picture of what your local colonies are actually experiencing at that very second.
And that dashboard builds directly on our previous discussion regarding the Hive Ops Center.
Oh yeah, the Hive Ops Center is a game changer.
It really is. As a quick refresher for you, think of the Hive Ops Center as a digital apiary assistant.
Because when you have thousands of colonies spread out, you just can't be everywhere at once.
Precisely. This system continuously analyzes local microclimates to tell you exactly when your bees are safe to fly, when they are actively making honey, and, perhaps most importantly, when you should just leave them completely undisturbed.
Knowing when to keep the lids closed is honestly half the battle in commercial beekeeping.
Without a doubt.
So let's start breaking down these invisible barriers that the dashboard tracks. And we should probably begin with the absolute primary gatekeeper for any colony, which is temperature. Specifically, that 55 degree Fahrenheit threshold.
Right, so from a purely biological standpoint, 55 degrees Fahrenheit is a hard physical boundary for Apis mellifera, the western honeybee.
It is a brick wall.
It really is. And it all comes down to the microscopic mechanics of their thoracic flight muscles.
Because they have to flap those wings incredibly fast.
Exactly. To achieve the lift necessary for flight, those muscles have to vibrate at incredibly high speeds. But they operate on a very strict thermoregulatory feedback loop.
Meaning they need heat to make heat.
You hit the nail on the head. Below 55 degrees, those flight muscles physically cannot vibrate fast enough to generate the internal heat required to keep the system running. The biological machinery simply stalls out.
In plain English, their engine block freezes. If they can't vibrate, they can't heat up, and they literally just drop out of the sky.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. And if the ambient temperature drops even further, say, below 45 degrees, the biology gets incredibly restrictive.
That's the danger zone.
Yeah. At 45 degrees, they lose what is known as the shivering threshold. They become permanently grounded. Their muscles cannot generate enough heat to keep their hemolymph, which is basically their blood, from freezing.
So the whole colony goes into lockdown.
Completely. The entire colony has to abandon any thought of foraging. They shift entirely into a tight survival cluster, just vibrating together inside the hive just to keep the queen alive.
And look, out in the commercial yards, that biological reality dictates my entire financial year.
I can imagine.
You might look at the thermometer on your truck, see it hit 60 degrees, and think, oh, the girls are good to fly. But out on the ground, even at 60 degrees, forcing your bees to fly is a massive, dangerous fuel-burning risk.
Because the ambient air is still pulling heat away from them.
Exactly. If the ambient temperature isn't at least 70 degrees in the shade, sustained flight is going to cost the colony more energy than they are ever going to bring back.
The return on investment is just upside down.
It's terrible. I have seen it happen where, a patch of sun breaks through, the foragers rush out to gather nectar, but the air is just too cold. They burn through their caloric reserves, simply trying to keep those thoracic muscles warm enough to stay airborne.
Just trying to survive the trip itself.
Right. And then you end up opening the supers. And for you listening, supers are the top boxes where the colony stores its surplus honey. So you open the supers hoping to see them filling up with fresh nectar.
But they're empty.
Worse than empty. You find out the risk didn't pay off, and they have actually depleted their winter reserves just trying to survive the flight.
Wow. The thermodynamics of that trip are just precarious. And temperature is only the first hurdle.
It only gets harder from there.
It does. Let's say it's 75 degrees, and those foragers manage to get into the air safely. They immediately encounter the next invisible barrier, which is the wind tax.
The wind tax is brutal.
The physics of insect flight change drastically when you introduce aerodynamic drag. According to peer-reviewed behavioral studies, a worker bee flying in a calm, 5-mile-per-hour breeze operates at a standard baseline metabolic cost.
Just cruising?
Just cruising, right. But if that wind picks up to just 15 miles per hour, the friction and drag against her wings and body cause her energy expenditure to increase by a staggering 500%.
When you are managing thousands of livestock, a 500% energy spike is terrifying. I call it the caloric math turning negative.
The caloric map turning negative? I like that.
It's the only way to look at it. Picture a single worker bee. She flies out, finds a great patch of blooming clover, and loads up her honey stomach with nectar.
A successful trip.
Until she turns around. If she has to fight a 15-mile-per-hour headwind all the way back to the apiary, she is burning more fuel than the nectar in her stomach is actually worth.
She is literally digesting the payload just to get home.
Exactly. It turns the entire colony into a sinking ship. My biggest obsession out in the fields is preventing colony starvation, and wind is a silent killer in that regard.
Which means at 15 miles per hour, they are essentially flying on empty by the time they reach the apiary.
If they even reach the apiary.
Right, because of drifting.
Yeah, that brings up the secondary nightmare of high winds, which is drifting. When you have exhausted foragers fighting heavy crosswinds, they get blown completely off course.
They just drop into whatever hive is closest.
Exactly. They end up dropping into the wrong hives just because they are too physically drained to make it to their own front door.
That has to wreak havoc on the yard.
It does. You lose your workforce in some hives while overcrowding others. Disease can spread rapidly between colonies, and the population balance gets completely thrown off.
So wind management is critical.
It's everything. And if that wind pushes past 20 miles per hour, the math is so abysmal that it effectively grounds the entire operation. They will just huddle inside the boxes, eating their stored honey, waiting for the air to still.
The foragers are essentially performing complex, real-time energy return equations. They're evaluating whether the caloric value of the floral source actually justifies the fuel expenditure of the aerodynamic drag.
And usually in high wind, it doesn't.
No, it doesn't. And even if they win that battle, even if the temperature is a perfect 80 degrees and the wind is completely calm, they still face a third, incredibly complex environmental hurdle.
Humidity.
Humidity. This metric entirely governs the final stage of honey production. To understand why humidity matters, we have to look at the physics of evaporation and a concept called vapor pressure deficit.
Yeah, please break down vapor pressure deficit for us, because out in the yards, we just call it wet air ruins the harvest.
Wet air ruins the harvest is scientifically accurate. Think of the ambient air outside the hive like a giant sponge.
Yep.
When a forager brings nectar back to the colony, it is mostly liquid water, roughly 70% moisture. To turn that thin liquid into chemically stable honey, the house bees have to drop that moisture content down below 18%.
They have to dry it out.
Exactly. But if the ambient humidity outside the hive is above 60%, that atmospheric sponge is already full of water.
So it can't absorb anymore.
Right. The vapor pressure deficit shrinks. This means the air is already so saturated that it physically stalls the evaporation process. The water in the nectar simply has nowhere to evaporate into.
Which creates a massive, exhausting chore for the
They
colony.
have to force the issue.
They do. When the humidity is high, the house bees have to compensate for that full sponge by fanning aggressively. They lock their legs onto the wax comb and beat their wings furiously just to force dry air through the boxes.
Like a living HVAC system.
Exactly like an HVAC system. And that wastes massive amounts of colony energy. Every calorie they spend beating their wings to fight high humidity is a calorie I would rather see them put toward queen breeding, raising healthy new brood, or consuming pollen sub.
And for those listening, pollen sub is the protein substitute used to boost the hive.
Right, it's what we feed them to help explode the hive's population before a major nectar flow. When the bees are stuck doing air conditioning work because the air is too wet, the whole growth cycle of the apiary slows to a crawl.
The diversion of resources is profound. Thousands of bees that could be expanding the colony are instead tethered to the comb, acting as fans. And the impact of humidity extends far beyond just the curing process inside the wooden boxes.
It affects the flowers too, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Out in the field, humidity controls flower pollen release through a process known as Anther dehiscence.
After dehiscence.
Yes. Most flowers simply will not crack open and release their pollen until the morning humidity drops and the temperature climbs.
So high humidity is really a double-edged sword.
Completely. It prevents the bees from curing the honey they already have inside the hive, while simultaneously locking up the fresh pollen resources they need to gather out in the field.
So when you put all of these invisible barriers together, the temperature gatekeeper, the wind tax, and the humidity sponge, you can start to see what a perfect day actually looks like through the lens of a honeybee.
It's a very narrow window.
It really is. Let's look at a sample readout from the live dashboard to show you what absolute optimal conditions look like. If you pull up the report and the mission reads foraging or active gathering, here is the specific data you want to see.
The sweet spot.
Yep. The temperature will read 78 degrees Fahrenheit. That is perfectly optimal for sustained flight without the risk of overheating the flight muscles.
Not too cold, not too hot.
Exactly. The wind will be sitting at a stable, gentle 8 miles per hour, meaning the caloric math is highly positive, and the humidity will be sitting nice and dry at exactly 50%.
And we know this specific window is optimal because it aligns flawlessly with the USDA ARS behavioral studies for peak nectar gathering.
The science backs it up perfectly.
It does. When you have those specific conditions, 78 degrees, an 8-mile-per-hour breeze, and 50% humidity, you have an environment where the bee's internal thermoregulatory feedback loop is operating effortlessly.
They aren't burning extra fuel.
Right. The aerodynamic drag on their wings is negligible, preserving their caloric payload, and the vapor pressure deficit is wide open, allowing for rapid, highly efficient dehumidification of the nectar once they bring it home.
And when you string together days or even weeks of those perfect conditions, that is when you get truly remarkable clinical-grade honey potency.
It's a noticeable difference.
Oh, absolutely. We aren't just talking about the generic sweet stuff you squeeze into your tea. We are talking about highly active, medically significant honey. The macro environment directly dictates the microchemistry.
They are completely linked.
Right. To give you an idea of the benchmarks we look at in the industry, consider a product like Weatherspoon MGO 400 Plus Jack.
A great standard benchmark.
Academically speaking, an MGO 400 plus rating sits right at the entry-level threshold for medical wound care. It requires excellent, stable foraging conditions to achieve that specific concentration of methylglyoxal.
You need a good run of weather for that.
You do. But when you hit those absolute perfect peak season harvest windows, when the temperature, wind, and humidity align flawlessly day after day, that is when you see the production of something like Manuka Health MGO 800 plus.
The absolute high-potency tier.
Yes. The raw efficiency of the hive operating in those specific weather windows directly translates to that incredible level of antibacterial activity.
It is such a brilliant illustration of how environmental physics directly influence biochemistry. Methylglyoxal, or MGO, is a compound that develops naturally in the nectar of the Manuka bush.
But the plant alone isn't enough?
Exactly. The final concentration of that MGO is entirely dependent on the bee's ability to forage efficiently and dehydrate that nectar quickly.
So the weather is doing the heavy lifting.
Without that specific 50% humidity and 78-degree temperature, The enzymatic processes that mature the honey and create those high MgO levels simply cannot operate at peak capacity.
It's amazing.
You are looking at a seamless direct connection between the weather patterns moving across the sky and the chemical reactions happening inside a microscopic cell of wax honeycomb.
Which brings us right back to the reality of standing out in that field in North Dakota. A honeybee colony is quite literally a precise biological barometer.
They really are.
When you understand the caloric math of fighting a headwind, the 55-degree engine block freeze, and the heavy toll of fighting wet air, it completely changes how you view a simple sunny day in your own backyard or local neighborhood.
It gives you a whole new appreciation.
It really does. You stop looking at the weather just in terms of whether you need to grab a jacket or sunglasses. You start seeing the invisible physics that millions of insects are navigating, calculating, and fighting against every single second of the day.
Shifting that perspective is what makes studying these creatures so rewarding. You are no longer just looking at nature, you are reading its underlying code.
Reading the code, that's a great way to put it.
And before we finish up today, there is one final, truly mind-bending metric on the dashboard that we haven't deeply discussed yet, but it is absolutely vital for you to ponder.
Oh, I know where this is going.
We have talked extensively about temperature, wind, and humidity. But there is another environmental factor that governs bee flight: solar navigation and the KP index.
Out of everything we track, this is the part that always feels like absolute science fiction to me, even after years of working in commercial yards.
The mechanics are astonishing. Bees navigate using polarized light patterns in the sky. Even on a completely overcast day, if there's just a tiny patch of blue sky visible, their specialized eyes can read the polarization of the light to perfectly calculate the exact position of the sun behind the clouds.
They have built-in sunglasses.
Sort of, yeah. They use this for optic flow navigation. But to use this visual system safely, they require a minimum of 100 meters of visibility.
So fog is a huge problem.
Right. If heavy fog rolls in and drops visibility below that 100-meter mark, their optical navigation system fails, and they will not leave the hive. But here is where it scales up to the cosmic level.
This is the crazy part.
Bees also rely heavily on geomagnetism. They possess microscopic magnetic crystals inside their abdomens that allow them to physically sense the Earth's magnetic field.
Like a literal compass.
A literal compass. And because they use this internal compass to orient themselves, distant solar flares and geomagnetic disruptions, events happening millions of miles away in space, can literally ground a local hive.
Space weather.
Space weather. A massive coronal mass ejection from the sun can send charged particles toward Earth, which spikes the KP index and violently distorts our local magnetic field.
So let me get this straight. You could be standing in your yard on a perfectly clear 78-degree day with no wind and perfect 50% humidity.
The perfect day we just described.
Right, but because of a solar flare occurring on the surface of the sun, the bees will refuse to leave the landing board.
Yes, because their internal navigational instruments are completely scrambled.
That is just incredible. Just think about that the next time you are outside enjoying a nice day. A wooden box full of insects sitting in a clover field in North Dakota is completely tethered to the magnetic storms happening on the surface of the sun.
The scale of it is hard to comprehend.
It is the ultimate reminder of how intricate, fragile, and deeply connected nature's math really is. We hope this discussion changes the way you look up at the sky and down at the flowers in your neighborhood.
It definitely changed how I see them.
Keep your eyes open, and we'll talk to you next time.